Miss Marple, an accident at the new church. Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and it warms my heart to know you're here with us tonight. Tell me, what is it that draws you to these cozy mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our daily stories. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. Topping out at noon. The morning sun of mid-June lay warm and golden across the village of St. Mary Mead, touching the ancient stones of the old church with gentle fingers and casting a particularly bright benediction upon the scaffolding that rose beside it, where the new church hall was nearing completion. Miss Marple, pausing at her gate with secateurs in hand, observed the bunting that had been strung along the scaffolding poles and reflected that there was something particularly hopeful about bunting. It suggested fêtes and coronations and all manner of optimistic gatherings. Today it suggested the topping out ceremony scheduled for noon precisely, when the final stone, a handsome square finial, would be hoisted into place atop the new hall. The whole village would be there naturally. Lady Ellerton, who had donated the funds for the hall, had seen to that. There were to be speeches and photographs and quantities of tea. Miss Marple had baked a seed cake herself, though Mrs. Millet at the bakery had been rather sniffy about homemade contributions, when the church guild could perfectly well have ordered everything from her shop. Human nature, Miss Marple thought, snipping a spray of roses for her sitting room, never changed. Mrs. Millet's wounded pride reminded her forcibly of a parlor-maid in her youth, who had taken great offense when the housekeeper had suggested that the silver might benefit from an extra polish. She glanced at the small watch pinned to her dress. 11. Time enough to arrange these roses and make her way to the church, where no doubt Dolly Bantry would be holding forth with her usual energy. By 11:45, it seemed that the entire population of St. Mary Mead had indeed gathered in the sunny space beside the new hall. The teas were hissing gently on their trestle tables. Children darted between the legs of their elders. The vicar, the Reverend Clement, stood in conversation with his wife Griselda, who looked particularly pretty in a pale blue dress that set off her fair hair. Miss Marple, arriving with her cake basket, was immediately commandeered by Lady Bantry. Dolly, as always, was in fine form. She seized Miss Marple's arm with enthusiasm and steered her toward the scaffolding where the main party stood. The square finial stone, a handsome piece of carved work, sat in its sling beside a hand winch of sturdy construction. A tall, spare man in working clothes was checking the mechanism with careful deliberation. This, Miss Marple understood, was Will Drew, the rigger and bell hanger, who had been responsible for much of the lifting work throughout the construction. Near him stood George Penrith, the builder-contractor, a brisk, expansive man with the heartiness that some men adopt when they wish to suggest success. He was speaking to Lady Ellerton, gesturing broadly at the finial and the scaffolding beyond. Lady Ellerton herself was resplendent in purple, her considerable bosom adorned with a formidable brooch that caught the sunlight. She was clearly enjoying her role as benefactress and kept glancing toward the photographer from the county newspaper, who was setting up his equipment at a respectful distance. A younger man, whom Miss Marple recognized as Tommy Penrith, George Penrith's nephew, was carrying a bucket of mortar up a ladder. He was a pleasant-looking young man with an open, honest face, and Miss Marple had observed him more than once in conversation with Nora Pike, the vicar's niece, who helped with the parish records. There were others, of course. Jack Mowbray, the jovial plumber glazier, was perched on the roof line, his leather apron visible above the scaffold boards. Dr. Haydock stood with his hands in his pockets, looking skeptical about the whole proceedings in the way that Dr. Haydock looked skeptical about most things. And there inevitably was Inspector Slack, who appeared to have appointed himself responsible for keeping the children at a safe distance from the scaffolding. But it was the man standing slightly apart, From the others who drew Miss Marple's particular attention, Adrian Fielding, the clerk of works, was a thin, precise individual with the air of a man who took his responsibilities with utmost seriousness. His face, Miss Marple noted, was set in lines that suggested recent displeasure. He held a small notebook in one hand and kept glancing at it, then at the winch, then at George Penrith, with an expression that was decidedly grim. Miss Marple, whose observation of human nature was both extensive and acute, recognized the signs. Mr. Fielding was not a happy man. More than that, he was a man who had discovered something that troubled him, something that involved the construction before them. She'd noticed these past few weeks that Fielding had been stopping work more frequently, examining mortar batches with particular care, questioning delivery notes. She had heard through the invaluable conduit of parish gossip that flowed through the post office and the shops that there had been words between Fielding and Penrith over the quality of materials and the pace of work. Buildings, like cakes, require proper ingredients mixed in proper proportions. Miss Marple, who had never skimped on eggs or butter in her baking, understood this instinctively. A man who cut corners in construction was no different from a cook who substituted margarine for butter and expected the same results. George Penrith was laughing at something Lady Ellerton said, but Miss Marple observed that his eyes kept drifting toward Adrian Fielding, and the laugh, hearty as it was, did not quite reach those eyes. The church clock began to strike noon. The murmur of conversation died away. The vicar stepped forward, and the crowd formed itself into a respectful semicircle. Reverend Clement, in his gentle voice, offered a prayer of thanksgiving for the work completed and a blessing for the final placing of the stone. It was a simple, sincere prayer, and Miss Marple, listening, felt the particular peace that comes from such moments of communal hope. Will Drew moved to the winch and checked the Powell mechanism one final time, his weathered hands moving with the confidence of long experience. The finial swung gently in its sling, the rope taut and ready. George Penrith stepped forward, beaming. This was clearly his moment, the culmination of the project, and he intended to savor it. Adrian Fielding moved slightly, positioning himself where he could sight the plumb line, ensuring that the stone would rise true and straight. His notebook was tucked into his jacket pocket now, and his face, though still grim, showed the concentration of a man devoted to his craft. The crowd pressed a little closer, children craning their necks, cameras ready. The vicar concluded his prayer with a simple Amen, and in the hush that followed, Will Drew placed his hand on the winch crank and began to turn. The mechanism engaged with a satisfying click. The rope tightened. The finial lifted smoothly from the ground, rising into the golden air of noon. A small cheer began to ripple through the crowd, and then, with a sound that Miss Marple would remember for the rest of her days, a sick, sliding roar of metal on metal, the drum of the winch ran suddenly, terribly free. The finial dropped like a stone from heaven, and Adrian Fielding, who had stepped forward just that moment to check its rise, never moved again. Chapter 2. A Finial Falls. There are moments in life when time itself seems to fracture. The ordinary flow of seconds becomes something else entirely. Each fragment of an instant, stretching and crystallizing until one can observe, details with a clarity that is almost unbearable. Miss Marple would later remember with perfect distinctness the way the dust rose in a single golden cloud where the stone struck. She would remember the precise angle of Lady Ellerton's hat as the woman turned, her mouth forming an O of horror. She would remember the way young Tommy Penrith's bucket of mortar tilted and spilled, forgotten as he stood frozen on his ladder. But in that first moment, there was only the sound, the heavy final thud of carved stone meeting earth and flesh. Then a woman screamed. Miss Marple thought it might have been Griselda Clement, though she could not be certain. The scream seemed to break whatever spell held the crowd motionless, And suddenly there was movement, a surge forward that Inspector Slack, recovering his wits with admirable speed, immediately attempted to control. "Stand back!" he barked, his voice harsh with authority and something that might have been shock. "Everyone stand back. Dr. Haydock, here if you please." The doctor was already moving, his skeptical expression replaced by the focused intensity of a medical man confronted with emergency. He dropped to his knees beside the fallen man with a speed that belied his years. Miss Marple found that her hand was gripping Dolly Bantry's arm, though she could not recall reaching for it. Dolly's face had gone quite white beneath her powder. "Jane," Dolly whispered. "Oh, Jane, is he—" She could not finish the question, but there was no need. Dr. Haydock was rising to his feet, dusting his knees with mechanical movements. His face told the story before his words did. "Dead," he said quietly to Inspector Slack. "Instantaneous, I should say. The impact." He paused, glanced at the growing crowd of pale, shocked faces, and lowered his voice further. "No suffering. That's something, at least." The Reverend Clement had his arm around his wife, who was trembling visibly. Lady Ellerton had sunk onto a nearby bench, her purple splendor suddenly diminished. Her hand pressed to her considerable bosom. The photographer stood with his camera hanging, forgotten, at his side, his young face quite green. George Penrith was standing perfectly still, staring at the scene before him, as though unable to comprehend it. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before words finally emerged. "The brake?" he said hoarsely. "The brake must have, but Will checked it. I saw him check it." Will Drew, the rigger, looked as though he had aged 10 years in as many seconds. His weathered face was ashen, and his hands, those careful, competent hands, were shaking. "I set the pawl," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I said it proper, same as always. I don't understand." "I don't." Miss Marple, still gripping Dolly's arm, moved slightly, not toward the terrible scene where the stone lay, and Dr. Haydock was gently covering Adrian Fielding's still form with his own jacket. Instead, she moved toward the winch itself, that innocently looking mechanism that had so catastrophically failed. The metal frame stood silent now. The drum motionless, the rope hung slack and useless. Miss Marple, acting on an instinct she could not have explained, reached out and touched the frame where the pawl mechanism was housed. When she withdrew her hand and glanced down at her glove, she saw something that made her still entirely. There, on the pale gray cotton, was a smear. A dull gray smear that had a peculiar quality to it. Not quite like the iron dust or machine oil one might expect. She said nothing. Not yet. Instead, she drew a handkerchief from her handbag with her other hand and carefully folded the glove away. Inspector Slack was organizing the scene with grim efficiency. The children had been shepherded away by their mothers. The teas sat forgotten, their cheerful hissing now seeming obscene in the altered atmosphere. The bunting hung limp in the still air. "I'll need statements from everyone who was near the winch," Slack was saying. "Mr. Drew, you'll stay here if you please. Mr. Penrith, you as well. The rest of you, I'll ask you to remain in the vicinity. No one is to leave until I've spoken with them." George Penrith seemed to rouse himself from his stupor. He passed a hand across his face, and when he spoke, his voice had recovered some of its earlier heartiness, though it rang false now, like a cracked bell attempting its old note. "A shocking accident," he said. Shocking! Poor Fielding. He was standing just there, you see, checking the rise of the stone. It was precisely where a clerk of works ought to stand. But when the brake failed, he shook his head. A terrible, terrible accident. Miss Marple observed him carefully. His hands, she noted, were restless, moving from his pockets to his lapels to his hair. When he pulled out his handkerchief to mop his brow, she saw that his cuff showed a faint mark, a grayish, line that might have been dirt or might have been something else. Entirely. Jack Mowbray had climbed down from the roofline and stood now with his leather apron still tied around his waist. On a nearby trestle lay his working rag, the one he used for lead wiping. Even from where she stood, Miss Marple could detect the distinctive smell of tallow and rosin. Will Drew was explaining the mechanism to Inspector Slack, his voice steadier now, but still carrying an undertone of disbelief. The pawle drops into the ratchet teeth. See? And it can't slip back. There's a collar here that holds it, and the collar's secured by a split pin through this hole. Without that pin holding firm, the collar could work loose, and if the collar works loose, the pawle might miss the teeth. But I checked it, Inspector. I always check it, Inspector Slack grunted. He was examining the mechanism with the air of a man who understood practical matters, even if he could not claim expertise in every trade. And this split pin, it's still in place? Drew peered at the mechanism, his brow furrowed. Appears to be, but... He touched it gently, and Miss Marple saw his expression change. That's odd. It seems to have... But before he could finish, Slack waved him back. Don't touch anything more. This whole apparatus will need to be examined properly. Miss Marple had moved a little away from the group and was standing near the spot where the finial had struck. Something caught her eye in the grass, a small, bright thing that glinted in the sun. She bent, her movement slow and deliberate as befitted an elderly lady, and with a handkerchief carefully lifted what appeared to be a bent fragment of metal. She studied it for a moment, turning it slightly. Then, with the same careful deliberation, she folded it into her handkerchief and placed it in her handbag. Near the scene stood a water barrel filled to the brim. It was positioned, she supposed, to lay the dust during the work, but something about it caught her attention. The rim was dusty, not splashed. For a barrel so full, sitting so close to where men had been working, that seemed rather unusual. Jane. Dolly had recovered somewhat and was at her elbow again. Jane, shouldn't we go? This is too dreadful. Poor Mr. Fielding. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Poor Mr. Fielding, indeed. He was a very conscientious man, I believe. Very particular about his work. Too particular, some said, Dolly whispered. I heard he'd been making rather a nuisance of himself, questioning this and that. George Penrith was getting quite annoyed, or so Mrs. Price told me. Miss Marple looked at her friend with interest. Indeed. How very unfortunate for Mr. Fielding. In the distance, they could hear the bell of the ambulance approaching. The photographer had been dispatched to telephone for one, though it was, of course, far too late for Adrian Fielding. Miss Marple glanced once more at the winch, at the position of the water barrel, at George Penrith's restless hands. Yes, she said again, almost to herself. Very unfortunate indeed. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Dull Gray. It was perhaps 2 hours later that Miss Marple found herself in her own sitting room, the June sunlight streaming through the windows in a manner that seemed almost offensive in its cheerfulness. The events at the church hall had cast a pall over the village that no amount of sunshine could dispel. Dolly Bantry sat in the chintz armchair, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She had not, Miss Marple observed, actually drunk any of it. I still cannot believe it, Dolly said for perhaps the 5th time. One moment everything was so festive, and the next, Jane, it was horrible. Yes, my dear, Miss Marple replied. Death often is, particularly when it comes so unexpectedly. Miss Marple set down her own teacup and reached for her handbag. Though I wonder if it was quite as unexpected as it appeared. Dolly's head came up sharply. What do you mean? Instead of answering directly, Miss Marple drew out her handkerchief and carefully unfolded it on the small table between them. The bent fragment of metal lay there, innocuous and small. I found this in the grass, Miss Marple said, near where the stone fell. It appears to be part of a split pin. the sort that Mr. Drew mentioned, the sort that would secure the collar on the winch mechanism. Dolly leaned forward, squinting at it. It looks rather ordinary, does it? Miss Marple picked it up delicately between thumb and forefinger. Look at the end where it is bent, and observe, if you would, what happens when I press it against this sheet of paper. She did so, and both women watched as a faint gray smear appeared on the white surface, rather like a pencil mark. Dolly frowned. That's peculiar. Shouldn't it be well harder? More like proper metal. One would think so, Miss Marple agreed. A split pin must be made of steel, something that will bite and hold under considerable strain. This, however, appears to be made of something altogether softer, something that would compress and shear when put under the weight of that finial. Stone, she set the fragment down and drew out her glove, the one she'd folded away so carefully. The smear on its surface was clearly visible in the afternoon light. I touched the winch frame, she explained. Just here, near where the collar sits. And I found this mark, dull gray, rather greasy in texture. Not at all like the clean iron dust one might expect from such machinery. Dolly was staring at her with dawning comprehension. Jane, are you suggesting that someone deliberately, but that's murder? I am suggesting nothing yet, Miss Marple said mildly, though her eyes were very sharp indeed. I am merely observing certain facts that strike me as unusual. Facts that perhaps ought to be brought to Inspector Slack's attention, though I fear he will not welcome them from me. She rose and moved to the window, looking out toward the church where the scaffolding still stood, the bunting now seeming like a mockery of the morning's hopes. There are other small things that trouble me, she continued. The water barrel, for instance. It was full to the brim, yet the rim was dusty. If men had been dipping water from it throughout the morning's work, surely there would be splashes and drips, and the plank beneath it showed a curious shine, as though something heavy had been dragged across it after the wood was already dusty. Perhaps they filled it just before the ceremony, Dolly suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. Perhaps. Miss Marple turned back to her friend. Tell me, Dolly, what do you know of Mr. Penrith's business affairs? Has the construction been proceeding smoothly? Dolly set down her cup with a decisive clink. Well, since you ask, I've heard things. Mrs. Price says that Penrith underbid the job considerably, trying to beat out Hargreaves and Sons for much less. The contract has penalty clauses if the work isn't finished on schedule, and lately, she paused, lowering her voice, though they were quite alone. Lately, Mr. Fielding had been stopping work more and more often, questioning the mortar, checking delivery notes twice over. He even threatened, Mrs. Price said, to halt the entire project until certain matters were resolved. How very interesting. Miss Marple resumed her seat. A conscientious man doing his duty, one might say, though I imagine such conscientiousness might prove expensive for a contractor working under a tight budget. You think Penrith killed him? Dolly's voice had dropped to a whisper. To prevent him from stopping the work? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that a public accident at the topping out ceremony would serve multiple purposes. It would explain away Mr. Fielding's death. It would suggest that the fault lay with the equipment, or perhaps with poor Mr. Drew's handling of it, and it would create such shock and confusion that any irregularities in the construction might be quite overlooked in the aftermath. She picked up the metal fragment again, turning it thoughtfully in her fingers. But how could anyone be certain that Mr. Fielding would be standing in precisely that spot when the stone fell? Miss Marple smiled faintly. A clerk of works always stands where he can sight the plumb line, particularly for an important lift with the whole village watching. It is his duty. Mr. Fielding was nothing if not dutiful. There was a knock at the door, and Miss Marple's maid announced Dr. Haydock. The doctor entered with his usual brisk manner, though his face was grave. "Thought I'd find you here, Miss Marple," he said, nodding to both ladies. And you too, Mrs. Bantry. Nasty business this morning. Will you take tea, Doctor? I will, thank you. He settled into a chair with a sigh. I've just come from giving my preliminary report to Slack. Death was instantaneous, as I said at the scene. The poor devil never knew what hit him, which is the only mercy in the whole sorry affair. And Inspector Slack, what is his view of the matter? Haydock snorted. Slack decided it was brake failure, pure and simple. An accident, tragic but straightforward. He's taken statements from Drew and Penrith and the others, but I suspect he'll close the matter as accidental death. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, but her fingers tightened slightly on her teacup. Did he examine the winch mechanism closely? Had a look at it, yes. The split pin was still in place, apparently, though Drew muttered something about it not feeling quite right. Slack told him he was in shock and not thinking clearly. I see. Miss Marple set down her cup. Doctor, you're a scientific man. Would you be so kind as to examine something for me? She indicated the fragment on the handkerchief. Haydock rose and bent over it, then picked it up with the air of a man humoring an elderly lady. But as he tested it between his fingers, his expression changed. Good Lord, this isn't steel at all. It's lead. Soft lead worked to resemble a pin. He looked at Miss Marple with new respect. Where did you find this? In the grass, where it must have fallen when the collar shifted? I suspect if Inspector Slack were to examine the winch housing more carefully, he might find a small indentation on the cheek where the collar crept sideways once the pin sheared. Haydock straightened up, his face set in grim lines. Miss Marple, if what you're suggesting is true, this was no accident. This was cold-blooded murder, planned and executed in front of the entire village. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. I rather think it was, though proving it may be somewhat more difficult than discovering it. We shall need more than a fragment of soft metal and a smear of gray on a glove. What we need, Dolly said suddenly, is for you to explain this to Slack before he closes the matter as an accident. Miss Marple smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. My dear Dolly, Inspector Slack has never welcomed my observations, but I think perhaps Dr. Haydock might present these findings in a way that even the inspector cannot ignore. Haydock nodded slowly. I'll speak to him this evening. He won't like it, but he's honest enough in his way. If there's evidence of foul play, he'll have to investigate properly. He paused. Poor Drew looked shattered. If this wasn't his fault, he deserves to know it. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Mr. Drew is an innocent man who might well have spent the rest of his life believing he had caused a death through carelessness. That, too, would have been a kind of murder. After the doctor had left, Dolly looked at her friend with something approaching awe. How did you know to look for these things, Jane? The pin, the smear on the frame. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The homely click of the needles a soothing counterpoint to the gravity of their discussion. I didn't know precisely, but I have observed over many years that when something appears to be an unfortunate accident, it is sometimes worth examining whether the misfortune was quite as accidental as it seems, particularly when the accident is convenient for someone. Chapter: The Winch That Wouldn't Hold. The following morning brought gray skies and a persistent drizzle that seemed to match the mood of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, standing at her window with a cup of coffee growing lukewarm in her hand, watched the rain streak the glass and thought about mechanisms and men. Inspector Slack had arrived at her cottage the previous evening, brought reluctantly by Dr. Haydock and wearing an expression that suggested he had bitten into something sour. He had examined the lead fragment with ill grace, listened to Miss Marple's observations with barely concealed impatience, and departed with the fragment wrapped in brown paper and a promise to make further inquiries that sounded more like a threat. Now, at 9 in the morning, Miss Marple had received a telephone call from Griselda Clement. Would Miss Marple possibly come to the vicarage? Will Drew was there, quite distressed and refusing to go home. He kept insisting that someone needed to understand about the winch, that he had done everything properly, and would Miss Marple please come because Griselda didn't know what to say to comfort him. "I don't believe it was your carelessness," Miss Marple said, "but I should very much like you to explain to me in detail how the mechanism works, particularly the part with the split pin." Relief flooded his face. He sat up straighter, and his hands came alive as he began to explain, gesturing to make his meaning clear. "The winch drum turns on a shaft, you see. When you crank the handle, the rope winds on, but you need a way to stop it running back under load. That's what the pawl does. It's a hinged lever that drops down and catches in the teeth of the ratchet wheel. Each tooth holds the pawl so the drum can't reverse." "I see," Miss Marple said, though she was not entirely certain she did. "And the collar you mentioned?" "The pawl's mounted on a collar that fits around the drum shaft. The collar has to stay exactly in position, or the pawl won't line up with the ratchet teeth. To keep it fixed, there's a hole through the collar and the shaft, and you put a split pin through. The split pin has 2 legs that you bend open so it can't work its way out. Without that pin holding true, the collar could shift sideways, even just a fraction, and the pawl would miss the ratchet." His voice had grown more confident as he spoke of familiar things, but now it faltered again. "I checked that pin, Miss Marple. I put my finger on it before we started the lift. It was there, firm as you please. But when it mattered, it must have failed somehow, and I can't fathom how." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew a handkerchief. She unfolded it carefully to reveal the fragment she had recovered from Dr. Haydock that morning. "Is this what a split pin should look like, Mr. Drew?" He took it gingerly, held it up to the gray light from the window. His expression changed as he tested it between his fingers. "This isn't steel," he said slowly. "This is soft as butter. This is lead, Miss Marple. Someone's shaped lead to look like a pin." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "I rather thought it might be. Can you tell me what would happen if such a false pin was substituted for the real one?" His face had gone quite pale. "Under light weight, it might hold. The collar wouldn't be bearing much sideways force, but under a heavy load, with the full weight of that finial stone pulling, the lead would compress and shear. The pin would fail, the collar would creep, and the pawl would miss the ratchet." He looked at her with dawning horror. "Someone did this deliberately. Someone meant for that stone to fall." "I believe so," Miss Marple said quietly. "Tell me, Mr. Drew, when you checked the pin before the lift, did you test it properly, or merely confirm it was present?" He flushed. "I put my finger on it to feel it was there. But I didn't pull at it or test the metal. Why would I? It had been in place when I inspected the winch on Friday, and there had been no one working on the mechanism since, had there not? Was the site left unattended at any time? Saturday afternoon the men had off. Sunday, of course, we didn't work. And Monday morning I was there early, did a general check before the ceremony." He paused. "But the winch itself, well, it stands there in the open. Anyone could have got to it over the weekend." "Anyone with knowledge of how it worked," Miss Marple observed. "And anyone with access to soft lead and the tools to shape it." Griselda, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up. "Jack Mowbray works with lead, doesn't he? For his plumbing and glazing." "He does," Drew agreed. "But Jack's a good man. I can't believe he'd do such a thing." "Nevertheless," Miss Marple said, "we must consider who had both the knowledge and the materials. Mr. Mowbray had the lead. Certainly, Mr. Penrith as contractor would understand the mechanism. You yourself, Mr. Drew, though I think we may safely eliminate you from suspicion." Drew managed a weak smile. "Thank you for that, at least." "There is also the question of motive," Miss Marple continued. Who would benefit from Mr. Fielding's death or from an accident that would disrupt the work and perhaps lay blame elsewhere? Fielding had been making life difficult for George Penrith, Drew said slowly. Checking everything twice, questioning the quality of materials. There had been words between them about the mortar mix just last week. Fielding said it was too lean, not enough cement. Penrith said Fielding was being unnecessarily particular. Was the mortar too lean? Drew hesitated. It was on the edge of acceptable. I've seen better and I've seen worse. But Fielding was right to question it. A man in his position has to maintain standards. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And if Mr. Fielding had persisted in his objections, if he had perhaps threatened to report the matter to higher authorities, the work could have been stopped. Penrith could have faced penalties, maybe even lost his contractor's license, if it was proven he'd been cutting corners deliberately. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Will Drew stared at the lead, fragment in his palm as though it was something venomous. My gloves, he said suddenly. When I checked the winch that morning, my gloves had clean iron dust on them, the kind you get from handling good steel. But Mr. Penrith, when he came to look at the mechanism after, I saw his cuff, Miss Marple. It had a grayish smear on it, different from honest dirt. Yes, Miss Marple said. I noticed that as well. It is a small thing, but small things often prove significant. She rose to leave, and Will Drew stood as well, some measure of his natural dignity restored. Thank you, Miss Marple. You've given me hope that the truth will out. The truth generally does, Miss Marple replied, though it sometimes requires a little encouragement. Good day, Mr. Drew, and do try to rest. You've had a dreadful shock. As she left the vicarage, the rain beginning to ease, Miss Marple reflected that they were making progress. The method was becoming clear. What remained was to establish beyond doubt who had fashioned that false pin, who had placed it in the mechanism, and who had arranged matters so that Adrian Fielding would be standing in precisely the wrong place when the winch failed. Small things, she thought. Small things built into large consequences, like bricks into a wall, or perhaps more aptly, like lead shavings pressed into the shape of something they could never truly be. Chapter 5. 2 daybooks. 1 entry. By Wednesday afternoon, the rain had cleared, leaving the village washed clean and smelling of wet earth and roses. Miss Marple had spent the intervening day in quiet reflection, and what Dolly Bantry, had she known of it, would have called detective work. Miss Marple herself would have described it merely as taking an interest in one's neighbors. She had learned through the pleasant medium of morning, calls and casual conversation that Adrian Fielding had kept meticulous notes in a small pocketbook, which he carried everywhere. She had also learned that Nora Pike, the vicar's niece who helped with parish records, had been assisting Mr. Fielding with copying certain entries just the week before his death. It was therefore with some satisfaction that Miss Marple found herself taking tea at the vicarage on Wednesday, with Nora Pike in attendance. Nora was a sensible young woman of perhaps 25, with quiet manners and observant eyes. She poured tea with steady hands, though Miss Marple detected a certain pallor in her complexion that suggested the events of Tuesday had affected her more than she cared to show. Such a terrible thing, Nora said, passing Miss Marple her cup. Poor Mr. Fielding. He was always so particular about safety, so careful about every detail of the work. I believe you assisted him with his record-keeping, Miss Marple said gently. Nora nodded. He asked me to make fair copies of some of his sight notes. His handwriting was quite small, you see, and he wanted clear records for his final report. I copied several pages for him last Thursday. Do you recall what was in those notes? Oh, yes. There were measurements, lists of materials delivered, observations about the work quality. Nora paused, setting down her own cup. There was one entry that seemed particularly important to him. He had written in capital letters, "Test lift, Drew only, no public." He underlined it twice. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. Test lift. How interesting. And when was this test lift scheduled? That's just it, Nora said, leaning forward. It wasn't scheduled for Tuesday at noon. Mr. Fielding's note indicated it should be done quietly, with just Mr. Drew present, to ensure the mechanism was sound before any public ceremony. Yet on Tuesday, the lift took place at noon, with the entire village watching. Exactly. Nora bit her lip. I mentioned it to Uncle Leonard, the vicar, you know, and he said perhaps the plans had changed. But it seemed odd to me. Griselda entered with a plate of biscuits. What seemed odd, darling? We were discussing Mr. Fielding's notes, Miss Marple explained. Miss Pike was kind enough to copy them, and they indicated the lift should have been a private test, not a public ceremony. Griselda frowned. But Lady Ellerton sent out invitations. She told everyone about the topping out at noon, with speeches and photographs. She was quite insistent about the time. Who arranged the ceremony with Lady Ellerton? Miss Marple asked. Why, Mr. Penrith, I believe. He came to see Leonard last week and said everything was ready for a proper celebration on Tuesday at noon sharp. Miss Marple filed this information away like a card in a catalog. I wonder, she said, whether Mr. Penrith keeps a day book for the construction work. Builders generally do, I believe, to record progress and any significant events. He does, Nora confirmed. He showed it to Uncle Leonard when he was explaining about the ceremony. I saw it when I was tidying the study afterward. He left it on the desk, and I glanced at it. Just the last page that was open. She colored slightly. I know I shouldn't have looked, but I was curious. And what did you see? Miss Marple's tone was encouraging rather than reproving. The entry for Tuesday said, Public lift, 12 sharp speeches to follow. But the handwriting looked different from the other entries. Rounder, somehow, and the ink color wasn't quite the same. Different handwriting, Miss Marple repeated softly. How very significant. Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, summoned by a telephone call from Miss Marple that had been phrased as a request, but carried the weight of necessity. He entered the vicarage with his usual air of harassed authority, and his expression suggested he was already regretting his decision to come. Well, Miss Marple, I'm a busy man. This had better be important. I believe it is, Inspector. Miss Pike has some information about Mr. Fielding's pocketbook that may prove relevant to your investigation. Slack listened to Nora's account with growing interest, his skepticism gradually giving way to professional attention. When she finished, he grunted. So Fielding wanted a private test, but Penrith arranged a public ceremony instead. That's suggestive, I'll grant you, but it's not evidence of murder. Perhaps not by itself, Miss Marple agreed. But I wonder, Inspector, whether you have examined Mr. Penrith's daybook. I understand there is an entry for Tuesday that may reward closer inspection. Slack's eyes narrowed. How do you know about Penrith's daybook? Miss Pike happened to see it, Miss Marple said smoothly, and she observed that the final entry appeared to be in a different hand from the earlier ones. Within 2 hours, Inspector Slack had retrieved the daybook from Penrith's site office and was examining it in the vicarage study with Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock, and the vicar as witnesses. The entry for Tuesday was exactly as Nora had described. The handwriting was indeed rounder than the preceding entries, and when Dr. Haydock held it to the light, he observed something else. This has a bluish sheen to it, he said, almost like a copying pencil rather than ordinary ink. May I? Miss Marple produced her handkerchief, dampened a corner of it with her tongue in a manner that would have horrified her great nieces, and touched it delicately to the figure 2 in the notation 12 sharp. The ink blurred immediately, spreading in a telltale blue smudge. Copying pencil, she said with satisfaction. The sort that transfers when moistened. Very convenient for making quick duplicate entries, but it has the unfortunate property of running if exposed to any dampness. Even the moisture from a thumb might blur it slightly. Slack examined the page more closely. The 2 is set a bit higher than it should be, too. Clumsy work. He looked at Miss Marple with grudging respect. You think Penrith added this entry himself? After Fielding's original notes showed something different? I think it possible that the builder's daybook was altered to show a public ceremony at noon, when Mr. Fielding's careful notes indicated no such thing was planned. Someone wanted a crowd present, Inspector. Someone wanted witnesses to what was meant to appear as a tragic accident. And if I compare this handwriting to other samples of Penrith's writing, I believe you'll find the rounded style of the figures, particularly the way the 2 is formed, quite distinctive. Reverend Clement, who had been listening with growing distress, spoke up. This is dreadful, to think that someone planned this so carefully, altered records, arranged matters so that poor Fielding would be killed in front of the entire village. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. It was carefully planned indeed, but careful planning often leaves traces, like the bluish sheen of copying pencil where ordinary ink should be, or a figure that sits just slightly wrong on the line. Inspector, Slack closed the daybook with a decisive snap. Right. I'll need to have another conversation with Mr. Penrith, and I'll want to compare this writing with his invoices and other documents. As he departed, daybook under his arm, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern was becoming clearer with each row, each small stitch revealing the larger design. Will this be enough to prove murder? Griselda asked. Not yet, Miss Marple replied. But we are gathering threads, my dear. And when enough threads are gathered, they form a rope that even the cleverest person cannot escape. Chapter 6. A Barrel That Didn't Splash. Thursday morning found Miss Marple walking slowly past the Church Hall construction site. Her basket over her arm, as though she had merely stopped on her way to the shops. The site was deserted now, the scaffolding standing idle, the bunting removed. A police constable stood guard near the entrance, looking bored and slightly damp from the morning mist. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly to him. Good morning, Constable. Such a tragic business. That it is, Miss Marple. Inspector's orders are, no one's to disturb anything until he gives the word. Quite right, Miss Marple agreed. I was merely looking. One feels such sympathy for poor Mr. Fielding's family. His sister came down from London yesterday, I understand. Yes. Miss, very cut up about it, she was. Miss Marple appeared to be studying the scaffolding with vague curiosity, but her eyes were in fact moving systematically across the scene. The winch stood silent, its rope still hanging loose. The area where the finial had struck remained marked with a dark stain that no amount of rain could wash away. And there, just beyond the fatal spot, stood the water barrel. I suppose, Miss Marple said conversationally, that barrel was useful for the workmen, to lay dust and such. I expect so. Miss, though it seems a funny place to put it, right where someone might trip over it in all the confusion. Yes, it does rather, doesn't it? Miss Marple moved a few steps closer, though she made no attempt to cross the barrier tape that Inspector Slack had strung around the immediate area. How full was it, do you know? On Tuesday, I mean. The constable scratched his head. Brim full, from what I could see. Water right up to the rim. And yet the rim itself appears quite dusty, Miss Marple observed. One would expect splashing if men had been dipping water throughout the morning. The constable looked at the barrel with new interest. That is odd, now you mention it. The ground beneath it is also curious. You see there on that plank, there's a sort of shine to it, as though something heavy had been dragged across after the dust had settled. You think someone moved it? I think perhaps someone positioned it very carefully after the accident occurred, to suggest, perhaps, that Mr. Fielding might have stumbled against it in his haste to check the rising stone, though of course he did nothing of the sort. The constable was looking distinctly uncomfortable now. I'd best mention this to the inspector, Miss Marple. I think that would be very wise. Miss Marple continued on her way, but instead of proceeding to the shops, she found herself taking the path that led around to the rear of the site, where various materials and equipment were stored. Here she encountered Tommy Penrith, George Penrith's nephew, sitting on a stack of timber with his head in his hands. He looked up as she approached, and she saw that his pleasant face was troubled. "Good morning, Tommy. You look rather downcast." "Morning, Miss Marple." He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. "It's all this business. I can't stop thinking about it. Mr. Fielding was a good man, particular, but fair. And now they're saying it wasn't an accident at all, that someone did it deliberate. You were working here on Tuesday morning, I believe." "Yes, miss. Fetching mortar mostly, and tools as they were needed. I handed a bag up to Jack Mowbray at about 10 to 12, just before the ceremony was to start." "Did you notice anything unusual? Anything that seemed out of place?" Tommy frowned, considering. "There was the danger board. I'd left it facing outward, warning-like, near where we dug out for the foundation drain. But when I came back from carrying mortar, it was hung the other way round, facing the wrong direction entirely. I thought maybe someone had knocked it turning, but it was hung proper on its nails, not just twisted. Why would someone turn a danger board around? That's what I couldn't fathom, unless they didn't want people to see the warning and stay back from that spot. But that makes no sense, does it? You'd want people to stay safe. Unless, Miss Marple thought, you wanted them to come closer. Wanted them to crowd forward to see the ceremony, to be witnesses to what was meant to look like a terrible accident. "Tommy, you mentioned the water barrel to me just now. Can you recall if it was in that position all morning?" He thought hard. "I don't rightly know, Miss Marple. There's always barrels about a site. But now you mention it. I remember thinking on Tuesday that the ground underneath looked dry, considering how full it was. You'd expect puddles if it had been there long, what, with men splashing water about?" "Yes, one would. Tell me, did you see your uncle near the barrel at any time, either before or after the accident?" Tommy's face clouded. "You're not thinking Uncle George had anything to do with this? I'm merely trying to establish what happened, my dear. Sometimes the truth requires us to consider possibilities we find uncomfortable." "I saw him near there afterward," Tommy admitted reluctantly. "When everyone was in shock and confusion, he was standing by the barrel, seemed to be catching his breath. His face was all white and strange-like. Did he touch the barrel? Move it, perhaps? I couldn't say for certain. There was such chaos, people running about, women crying. But I remember thinking it was odd that he wasn't with the others, wasn't trying to help or organize things the way he usually does. He was just standing there by that barrel. And when I called to him, he nearly jumped. Out of his skin, Miss Marple thanked Tommy and continued her walk, her mind working methodically through the facts. The barrel had been positioned after the accident to suggest a natural obstacle. The danger board had been turned to draw the crowd closer rather than warn them away. The timing of the ceremony had been carefully arranged for noon, when the sun would be at a particular angle. Someone had staged the scene with considerable thought. She found Dolly Bantry at the lending library, returning a stack of novels and looking for something more cheerful than the murder. Mysteries she'd been reading, they seem rather too real at the moment, Dolly explained. "Jane, you look as though you've been doing your investigating walk. What have you discovered?" "Several small things that form an interesting pattern. The water barrel, for instance, was almost certainly moved into position after Mr. Fielding fell, to create the appearance of a hazard that might explain his position in the danger zone. But why bother? Everyone saw what happened. The stone fell from the winch. Yes, but a clever murderer thinks ahead. If questions were raised, if the accident were examined too closely, then small details like the placement of a barrel might distract from more damning evidence. It's the same principle as a magician directing your attention to his right hand while his left performs the trick. Dolly shuddered. It's chilling, really, to think someone could be so calculating. Murder generally is, Miss Marple replied. Though I find that even the cleverest murderers often make mistakes. They remember to arrange the large deceptions, but forget about small inconsistencies. A barrel that doesn't splash, a board that faces the wrong way. These things tell their own story to anyone who cares to read it. And you're reading it, aren't you, Jane? I'm trying to, Miss Marple said, though I confess there are still pieces of the puzzle that don't quite fit. But they will, my dear. They generally do, given time and patience. That evening, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a notebook and an expression of grudging purpose. I've examined that barrel, he announced. You were right about the drag marks. Someone positioned it after the event, and the constable found scuff marks suggesting it had been pushed from about 6 feet away. How very interesting. Furthermore, I've compared the handwriting in Penrith's daybook with his invoices and correspondence. The way he forms his figures, particularly the number 2, matches exactly. He wrote that entry himself. Then you have evidence of deliberate deception. I have evidence that he altered his records, Slack corrected. But that's not quite the same as proof of murder. I need more, Miss Marple. I need the real steel pin, or the tools used to make the false one, or some connection that ties it all together. Miss Marple smiled gently. Then perhaps, Inspector, we should look more carefully at where such things might be found. A builder's site is full of places where a clever man might hide evidence, or more often, where he might think he's hidden it, when in fact he's merely overlooked how thoroughly such places can be searched. Chapter 7. Lead Shavings in a Tea Hut. Friday morning brought with it a return of sunshine, and Miss Marple, having obtained Inspector Slack's somewhat irritable permission, made her way to the construction site with Dolly, Bantry in tow. The constable had been replaced by a different officer, younger and more inclined to be helpful. When Miss Marple explained that she had the inspector's authorization to examine the tea hut was a rough structure of weathered boards, furnished with a battered table, several chairs of uncertain stability, and a paraffin stove that had clearly seen better days. A kettle sat on the stove, and various enamel mugs hung from nails along one wall. The whole place smelled of tea leaves, tobacco, and the particular mustiness that comes from damp wood. What exactly are we looking for? Dolly asked, eyeing the grimy surroundings with distaste. Evidence of manufacture, Miss Marple replied. If someone fashioned a false pin from lead, they needed tools and a workspace. This hut would provide both privacy and a convenient explanation for the presence of metal scraps. She moved slowly around the small space, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The table bore the scars of hard use, its surface marked with knife cuts, burn marks from hot mugs, and various stains. Near one edge, where the light from the small window fell most directly, she paused. Dolly, my dear, would you bring me that magnifying glass from my bag? Dolly complied, and Miss Marple bent over the table, examining it with minute attention. After a moment, she straightened up with an expression of satisfaction. Look here. These tiny curls of metal caught in the wood grain. They're bright and fresh, not oxidized as old shavings would be. Dolly peered through the glass. They're so small. How can you tell what they are? Touch one carefully with your fingertip. Dolly did so, then rubbed her finger and thumb together. It's soft, and it leaves a gray mark, like pencil lead. Precisely. These are lead shavings created by someone who was shaping lead with cutting. Tools, and they're fresh, which suggests they were made recently, certainly within the past few days. Miss Marple moved to the bench that ran along the wall. Here men would sit to eat their lunch or rest during breaks. The bench showed signs of much use, but again something caught her attention. She lifted a cloth that lay bunched at one end. "This appears to be a working rag," she observed. "Rather stiff with some substance, oil perhaps, or wax." She held it delicately to her nose and sniffed. Tallow and rosin, the mixture plumbers use for wiping lead joints. This would be Mr. Mowbray's, I expect. Then it was Mowbray who made the false pin. Not necessarily. The rag belongs to him certainly, but a tea hut is communal space. Anyone might have borrowed it. However, the presence of both lead shavings and a plumber's wiping rag in the same small space is suggestive. She continued her examination, opening the various tins and boxes that lined a rough shelf. Tea, sugar, condensed milk, biscuits in a rusted tin. Then, pushed to the back, behind a jar of instant coffee, she found something more interesting. Pair of pliers, whose jaws showed a faint greasy residue that caught the light with a dull gleam. These have been used recently to work soft metal, Miss Marple said. You can see where the jaws have compressed something that left this deposit. Not the kind of mark that comes from gripping steel or iron. Dolly was looking increasingly uneasy. "Jane, shouldn't we leave this for the police? We're disturbing evidence. We're examining evidence." "My dear, which is rather different, and I'm being extremely careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily." She wrapped the pliers carefully in her handkerchief and set them aside. "Inspector Slack will want to see these." She moved to the small cupboard near the stove, opening it to reveal the usual detritus of a workman's refuge. More mugs, some newspaper for kindling, a few tools of various types, and there on the upper shelf, a paper bag that rustled when she touched it. Inside were offcuts of lead rolled into neat coils, the way a careful tradesman would store them. These, presumably, were Jack Mowbray's legitimate supplies for his glazing work. "These are rolled, not shaved," Miss Marple observed. Mr. Mowbray would cut his lead to length and roll the excess for later use. But the shavings on the table were created by someone shaping lead with considerable precision, whittling it almost, to achieve a particular form. "The form of a split pin," Dolly said. "Exactly." They spent another quarter hour in the hut, but Miss Marple found nothing else of immediate significance. As they emerged into the sunshine, they encountered Jack Mowbray himself, arriving with his tool bag and looking somewhat haggard. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Bantry, "you gave me a start. I wasn't expecting anyone to be here." "Inspector Slack gave me permission to look around," Miss Marple explained. "I hope you don't mind?" "We were examining the tea hut." "The tea hut?" Mowbray set down his bag. "What on earth for?" "Merely being thorough." "Tell me, Mr. Mowbray, do you keep your lead supplies in the hut?" "Some of them?" "Yes, the offcuts and such. Why?" "And your wiping rag, the one with tallow and rosin?" He looked puzzled. "That old thing? It's usually on the trestle near where I work, but I might have left it in the hut. I'm not particular about it. Any of the lads might use it if they need to wipe something down." "I see. And did you work with lead in the tea hut recently?" "Cutting or shaping it, perhaps?" "Me?" "No, miss, I do my lead work on site, where it's needed. The hut's for tea breaks and shelter from rain, not for proper work." His puzzlement was giving way to concern. "Has something happened? Is this about Mr. Fielding's accident?" "I'm afraid it wasn't an accident, Mr. Mowbray. Someone deliberately sabotaged the winch mechanism." His face went pale. "Sabotaged?" but that's murder." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "I'm afraid it is." "And you think someone used my lead, my tools?" He looked genuinely horrified. "But I had nothing against Fielding. He was strict, but he was fair. I had no reason to wish him harm." "Can you account for your movements on the morning of Tuesday?" "I was on the roof most of the morning, fitting the flashing along the edge. Tommy handed up my tool bag around 10 to 12. Before that, I'd been up and down the ladder fetching materials. At least a dozen people must have seen me." "And your lead supplies? Were they secure?" "Anyone could get at them, miss. The hut's never locked during working hours. Any of the men might have taken some lead if they needed it for something." After he had gone, looking shaken, Dolly turned to Miss Marple. "Do you believe him?" "I believe he's telling the truth about his own actions. But the presence of fresh lead shavings in the tea hut, combined with that plumber's rag and those pliers, suggests someone used his materials to create the false pin. Someone who had access to the hut and the knowledge to shape lead convincingly. Someone like George Penrith. Someone exactly like George Penrith. A builder would have the skills and the understanding of materials. He would know how to work lead, how to make it resemble steel superficially, and he would have had ample opportunity to enter the tea hut without arousing suspicion." Miss Marple looked back at the small structure with its weathered boards and grimy windows. "It's often the case," she observed, "that the most damning evidence is found in the most ordinary places. A tea hut is such a commonplace thing, unremarkable and unsuspicious. But it was here, I believe, that murder was carefully prepared, one tiny shaving at a time." Chapter 8. Alibi. Under the scaffolding. Inspector Slack spread his notebook on Miss Marple's dining table with the air of a man who had reached the limits of his patience. It was Friday evening, and he had spent the better part of the day taking statements and re-examining the construction site. "Right then," he said. "I've got everyone's movements accounted for between 11:45 and 10 past, which covers when the mechanism must have been checked and when the accident occurred. The question is whether any of them had opportunity to tamper with the winch beforehand." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. "Perhaps you might summarize what you've learned, Inspector. Fresh ears sometimes catch what a tired mind might miss." Slack grunted, but consulted his notes. Will Drew was at the winch from 11:45 onward. Half the village saw him there, checking the mechanism, preparing for the lift. He never left his post until after Fielding was struck, so Mr. Drew could not have substituted the pin at that time, not unless he did it earlier. But by his own account, he checked the mechanism on Friday afternoon and again first thing Monday morning, and the steel pin was in place both times. The site was unattended over the weekend, which gives us Saturday afternoon and all day Sunday, Miss Marple observed, when anyone might have accessed the winch. "Precisely. Moving on. Jack Mowbray was on the roof line from about 11:30, fitting the lead flashing. Young Tommy handed up his tool bag at 10 to 12, and several witnesses confirmed seeing Mowbray working up there right through the ceremony. He couldn't have reached the winch without coming down, and he didn't. His materials were available to others. However, yes, we've established that the lead, the rag, the pliers, any of them could have been borrowed." Slack turned a page. "Tommy Penrith was fetching mortar and materials all morning. He was seen by various people at various times, never near the winch itself. His alibi solid for the crucial period. And Mr. Fielding himself? Fielding spent most of the morning inspecting the work, making his usual notes. According to Nora Pike, he seemed agitated. He told her he needed to check a delivery slip after the ceremony, and that he intended to telephone the county surveyor. She got the impression he'd found something seriously wrong." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "Something that would stop the work, perhaps." "Very possibly. Which brings us to George Penrith. Slack's expression hardened. Penrith claims he was in the tea hut with Lady Ellerton from about 11:50 to 12:05, reviewing the program for speeches and photographs. And does Lady Ellerton confirm this? She confirms being in the tea hut with him, but she's vague about the time. Says it felt like only 5 minutes, not 15. She remembers looking at the church clock when she came out, and being surprised it was already 5 to 12. How interesting. What was Mr. Penrith doing during this time? According to Lady Ellerton, he was showing her a diagram of the completed hall, discussing where photographs should be taken for the best effect. She remembers he kept wiping his hands on his handkerchief. Said something about having touched some putty that Jack Mowbray had left lying about. Miss Marple paused in her knitting. Putty? That's what he told her. Said he'd fetched it from Mowbray for a window repair. But the windows aren't yet installed, are they? No, they're not. I checked with Mowbray. He hasn't done any putty work on this site at all. The glazing is scheduled for next week. Then Mr. Penrith was explaining away something on his hands. Something that might have looked like putty, but was in fact something else. Lead residue, you mean, from shaping the false pin. It would leave a grayish, greasy mark, I imagine, rather like putty in appearance, especially to someone not looking closely. Slack nodded grimly. I've also checked his movements over the weekend. Saturday afternoon he was at the site, supposedly reviewing progress, alone. Sunday morning he attended church, but Sunday afternoon he claimed to be working in his office. No one can verify that. Ample opportunity, in other words, to access the winch and make the substitution. Yes, but there's more. I've spoken with the suppliers about the deliveries Fielding had been questioning. Turns out Penrith altered an entry in the delivery book, changed a weight of cement from 30 bags to 40, making it look like more had been delivered than actually had. Miss Marple looked up sharply. He was shortchanging the materials and compensating by using extra sand in the mortar mix, which is cheaper but weakens the structure. Fielding had spotted it and was gathering evidence. Those notes Nora Pike copied were damning. If Fielding had gone to the county surveyor, Penrith would have faced penalties, possibly criminal charges for fraud. A strong motive for murder, then? Strong enough, but I still need physical evidence. I need the real steel pin, or a definitive link between Penrith and the false one. Miss Marple sat down her knitting and regarded the inspector with a thoughtful expression. Have you searched Mr. Penrith's person, his pockets, his clothing? Not yet. I don't have quite enough for a warrant to search him or his premises. The handwriting in the daybook and the altered delivery records give me fraud, but not murder. I need something more concrete. Then perhaps, Miss Marple said delicately, you should look for something Mr. Penrith would have needed to keep. Something he couldn't simply discard or destroy because it might prove useful as evidence of accident rather than murder. Slack frowned. What do you mean? The real split pin, Inspector. If someone removes a steel pin and replaces it with a lead counterfeit, what becomes of the original? A cautious man might throw it away, melt it down, dispose of it entirely. But a clever man, a man planning what he believes to be the perfect accident, might keep it. Why would he do that? Consider the scenario he envisioned. The winch fails. The stone falls. Mr. Fielding is killed in what appears to be a tragic accident. An investigation follows. Someone examines the mechanism and finds the bent remains of what looks like a split pin. A metallurgist might test it and discover it's lead, not steel. At that point, Mr. Penrith produces the real pin and claims he removed it himself for inspection just before the ceremony, meaning to replace it, but being distracted by Lady Ellerton's questions. The false pin was planted by someone else, someone trying to frame him, perhaps. Slack's eyes widened. He'd claim he was being set up. Exactly. The real pin in his possession would be his insurance, his proof that he had innocent access to it. Of course, he never anticipated that anyone would notice the gray smear, the lead shavings, the copying pencil in his daybook. He thought the accident would be accepted at face value. Then he might still have it on him, in a pocket, or in his office. I would suggest a pocket. A man committing murder would want his insurance close at hand, particularly in the immediate aftermath, when he might need to produce it quickly. Slack stood abruptly. Right. I'm going to have another conversation with Mr. Penrith, and this time, Miss Marple, I'm going to be considerably less polite about what I ask him to turn out of his pockets. After he had gone, Dolly emerged from the kitchen, where she had been discreetly listening. Do you really think he kept the pin, Jane? I think that intelligent people often make foolish mistakes when they believe themselves to be very clever. Mr. Penrith planned his murder carefully, but he planned it as though everyone else was stupid. He didn't account for small inconsistencies for observers who noticed, details for the simple fact that elaborate deceptions often unravel when pulled at the right thread. And the pin is the right thread. The pin is the proof, my dear. Everything else is suggestive, but the pin, if it's found in his possession, is definitive. A man has no innocent reason to carry a removed split pin from a winch mechanism in his pocket, especially not one that shows grease from that specific winch and a smudge of copying pencil from his own altered records. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking with quiet confidence. Yes, she said softly. I rather think Inspector Slack will find his evidence, and when he does, Mr. Penrith will discover that cleverness without wisdom is a dangerous thing indeed. Chapter 9. The Real Pin in Brown Paper. Saturday morning. Arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that follows rain, the air washed clean, and the gardens of St. Mary Mead displaying their roses and delphiniums with renewed vigor. Miss Marple, deadheading her own roses with careful attention, observed Inspector Slack's official motor car pull up outside her gate shortly before 10 o'clock. The inspector's expression as he came up the path told her everything she needed to know before he spoke a word. You were right, he said without preamble. I've got him. Miss Marple set down her secateurs. You found the pin. Found it, and a good deal more besides. May I come in? I'd like you to hear the full account. Once settled in her sitting room with the inevitable tea, Slack produced his notebook with something approaching satisfaction. I called on Penrith at his office yesterday evening, told him I needed to clarify a few points about his statement. He was nervous, kept shifting about in his chair, touching his pockets. When I asked him directly about the putty he'd mentioned to Lady Ellerton, he went a bit pale, then claimed he must have been mistaken about which site it came from. A weak explanation. Very weak. So I informed him that we had evidence suggesting the winch failure was not accidental, and that I would need to examine any items he might have on his person related to the construction. He objected, of course, threatened to call his solicitor, but when I suggested we could do it, formally at the station if he preferred, he backed down, Slack, paused to take a sip of tea, drawing out the moment, with what Miss Marple recognized as theatrical instinct. In his inside jacket pocket, wrapped in a twist of brown paper, I found a split pin, steel clean, with a small amount of machine, grease on the legs, exactly the sort that would secure a collar on a winch mechanism. And could you identify it as coming from the specific winch in question? Better than that. When Dr. Haydock examined it under his lens, he found something else. A smudge of blue on one leg of the pin, the same copying pencil blue that was in Penrith's altered daybook entry. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. He handled both the pin and the copying pencil, leaving traces of one on the other. Exactly. The fool must have written the false entry in his daybook, then handled the pin afterward, transferring the blue residue. It's distinctive stuff, that copying pencil. Haydock says it's unmistakable under magnification. And what was Mr. Penrith's explanation for having the pin? Slack smiled grimly. First, he claimed he'd found it on the ground after the accident and picked it up without thinking. When I pointed out that it showed no signs of being dropped or lying in dirt, he changed his story. Said he'd removed it earlier for inspection and forgotten to replace it, which would make him culpable for negligent homicide at minimum. Precisely what I told him. At that point, he stopped talking and demanded his solicitor, but the damage was done. I had the pin and I had him rattled. What else did you find? In the same pocket, wrapped with the pin, was a fragment of the brown paper. When I examined Penrith's hands under better light, there was a gray thumb mark inside the paper. Exactly the sort that would come from handling lead. Haydock tested it, lead residue mixed with traces of tallow and rosin from Mr. Mowbray's wiping rag, yes, Penrith, shaped the false pin using Mowbray's materials, and in doing so got the residue on his hands. He wiped them, but enough remained to leave marks. The brown paper was what he used to protect the real pin, to keep it clean, as evidence of his supposed innocence. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the winch housing itself, did you find any further evidence there? I had it dismantled this morning with Will Drew supervising. Caught in the congealed grease where the collar sits, we found a tiny curl of lead, fresh and bright, exactly like the shavings you found in the tea hut. It must have caught there when Penrith was fitting the false pin. A comprehensive case, then. Very nearly. I've also re-examined his financial records. The man was desperate. He'd underbid the job badly, was already behind schedule, and the penalty clauses in his contract would have ruined him. Fielding's report would have made matters infinitely worse. Criminal charges for fraud, loss of his contractors, license, possible bankruptcy, slack. Leaned back in his chair with an expression of tired satisfaction. Murder must have seemed like his only way out. Killing make. It looked like an equipment failure, or perhaps Drew's negligence, and bury the evidence of his corner cutting in the confusion. But he underestimated the attention that people pay to small details. He underestimated you, Miss Marple, and he underestimated the fact that physical evidence doesn't lie. You can forge a daybook entry and move a water barrel to stage a scene, but you can't explain away a steal. Pin with copying pencil on it found in your pocket, or lead residue on your cuff, or fresh lead shavings in a place where you had access and opportunity. There was a knock at the door, and Dolly Bantry entered in a state of considerable agitation. Jane, have you heard? They've arrested George Penrith. It's all over the village. Mrs. Price saw them take him to the police station not an hour ago. Yes, my dear. Inspector Slack was just telling me about it. Dolly sank into a chair. It's dreadful to think he planned it so carefully, killed a man in front of everyone, and thought he'd get away with it. He very nearly did, Slack admitted. If Miss Marple hadn't noticed that gray smear on her glove, if she hadn't picked up that bit of soft metal in the grass, we might well have closed it as accidental death. Drew would have lived the rest of his life thinking he'd killed a man through carelessness. What will happen to Mr. Penrith now? Dolly asked. He'll be charged with murder. The evidence is substantial. The false pin fashioned from lead, the real pin kept as insurance, the altered records, the staged scene with the barrel and the danger board. His motive was clear and his opportunity was ample. The Crown prosecutor will have a strong case. And Tommy? Miss Marple asked quietly. The nephew knew nothing about it. I'm convinced of that. The boy's devastated. He worshipped his uncle, thought he was getting an honest trade. Now he's learning that the man he admired was a cheat and a murderer. Poor boy, Miss Marple murmured. Another victim of George Penrith's crimes, though not in the way he intended. After Inspector Slack had departed, Dolly turned to her friend with something like awe. How did you know, Jane? From the very beginning. How did you know it wasn't an accident? Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the familiar rhythm of the needles a comfort after the unpleasantness of the morning's revelations. I didn't know, my dear. Not at first, but there were small things that didn't quite fit. The gray smear that wasn't iron dust, the water barrel that didn't splash, the copying pencil entry in a book that should have been kept in proper ink. These things suggested careful planning, and careful planning suggested deliberate intent. And the pin itself, a split pin, is such a small thing, isn't it? A bit of bent wire that holds a mechanism together. But like so many small things, it can be the difference between safety and catastrophe, between accident and murder. Mr. Penrith understood that. What he didn't understand was that small things work both ways. The tiny curl of lead in the grease, the blue smudge on steel, the fresh shavings on the tea hut table. All small things, but together they told a story he couldn't erase. She smiled faintly. Churches are built of faith and pins, I told Dolly last week. One must be very sure of which one holds. George Penrith fashioned a pin of lead and faith, and discovered that neither was strong enough to bear the weight of murder. Chapter 10. Yard. Cotter, Barrel, and the builder, who called it accident. The afternoon sun slanted across the construction yard, casting long shadows from the silent scaffolding. It was Monday, 4 days after George Penrith's arrest, and a small group had gathered at the site at Inspector Slack's request. He wished, he had said, to demonstrate how the crime had been committed, with Miss Marple's assistance in explaining certain technical points. Miss Marple stood near the winch mechanism, her gloved hands folded over her handbag, looking every inch the elderly spinster lady that most people took her to. By beside her stood Dolly Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Will Drew, and young Tommy Penrith, whose face still bore the shadows of shock and grief. Jack Mowbray was there as well, his usually jolly expression replaced by somber attention. The Reverend Clement had come with Griselda and Nora Pike, representing, as he said quietly, the moral authority of the parish. Inspector Slack cleared his throat and consulted his notebook, though Miss Marple suspected he knew its contents by heart. Right then. I've asked you all here because there's been considerable speculation in the village about what happened last Tuesday. I want to set the record straight, and I want certain people to understand that they bear no blame for what occurred. He looked directly at Will Drew as he said this, and the rigor's weathered face showed relief mixed with lingering pain. The facts are these. Adrian Fielding was murdered by George Penrith, contractor for this project. The murder was planned with considerable care and executed in broad daylight before dozens of witnesses, disguised as an equipment failure. Slack moved to the winch and laid his hand on the frame. The method was ingenious in its simplicity. This winch mechanism uses a pawl and ratchet system to prevent the drum from running backward under load. The pawl is mounted on a collar that must remain precisely positioned. That collar is held in place by a split pin, a small piece of steel bent through a hole to secure it. He produced 2 items from his pocket, both wrapped in clear evidence bags. One contained the bent fragment of lead that Miss Marple had found. The other held the steel pin that had been discovered in Penrith's possession. Sometime over the weekend, Penrith came to this site alone. He removed the real steel pin and replaced it with a counterfeit he had fashioned from soft lead. The lead pin looked convincing at a glance, but under the strain of lifting that heavy finial stone, it sheared and compressed. The collar shifted. The pawl missed the ratchet teeth, and the drum ran free. But how could he be certain the stone would strike Mr. Fielding? Reverend, Clement asked. Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her voice gentle but clear. Because Mr. Fielding was a conscientious man who always stood where he could sight the plumb line during an important lift. It was his duty, and George Penrith knew he would perform it. The timing was also carefully arranged. Penrith altered his own daybook to show a public ceremony at noon, though Mr. Fielding's notes clearly indicated only a private test lift should take place. She moved slowly toward the water barrel that still stood near the fatal spot. After the stone fell in the confusion and horror that followed, Penrith took moments to stage the scene. This barrel was pushed into position to suggest a natural hazard. You see here on the plank beneath the drag marks where it was moved across dusty wood. The rim of the barrel itself shows no splash marks, though it was supposedly full all morning during active construction. Tommy Penrith spoke, his voice breaking slightly. The danger board, too. I'd left it facing outward as a warning, but someone turned it the other way. I thought I'd made a mistake, but I hadn't, had I? No, Tommy, Miss Marple said kindly. Your uncle turned it to encourage the crowd to press closer, to ensure maximum witnesses to what he wanted. Everyone to believe was a tragic accident. Inspector? Slack resumed his explanation. The evidence against Penrith is comprehensive. First, the false pin itself, fashioned from Mead using materials and tools available in the tea hut. We found fresh lead shavings on the table where men cut their bread, and pliers showing greasy residue from working soft metal. He held up the steel pin. Second, the real pin, which Penrith kept in his pocket wrapped in brown paper. He intended it as insurance, as proof of his innocence should questions arise, but it betrayed him instead. On one leg of this pin is a smudge of copying pencil blue, the same substance he used to alter the entry in his daybook. Dr. Haydock stepped forward. I examined that smudge under magnification. It's unmistakable. The copying pencil transfers when moistened, and Penrith must have licked his thumb while writing the false entry, then handled the pin, leaving the blue residue. Third, Slack continued, we found traces of lead and tallow mixed on Penrith's cuff and on the brown paper wrapping. The tallow came from Jack Mowbray's lead wiping rag, which Penrith used when shaping the false pin. Fourth, we discovered a tiny curl of lead pressed into the grease of the winch housing deposited when the false pin was fitted. Fifth, Penrith had motive. He was financially desperate, having underbid this job and fallen behind schedule. He'd been cutting corners on materials, using too much sand in the mortar mix, and falsifying delivery records. Adrian Fielding had discovered this fraud and was planning to report it to the county surveyor. Such a report would have meant penalties, criminal charges, and the end of Penrith's business. Will Drew spoke up, his voice rough. Mr. Fielding was doing his job, keeping standards. He didn't deserve to die for it. No, Miss Marple agreed. He did not. But George Penrith saw murder as his solution. Kill Fielding, stage an accident that might be blamed on equipment failure or even on Mr. Drew's handling, and bury the evidence of fraud in the confusion that followed. What made you suspect it wasn't an accident? Nora Pike asked. Small inconsistencies, my dear. The gray smear on my glove when I touched the winch frame. It was dull and soft, not like iron dust at all. Then the fragment I found in the grass, which bent like lead rather than steel. The water barrel that showed no evidence of use, despite being supposedly full all morning. These things suggested deliberate staging rather than misfortune. She moved back to stand beside the winch, her hand resting lightly on the frame. Churches are built on faith, she said quietly. But they're also built on countless small solid things, pins and bolts, mortar and stone, each chosen for its strength and reliability. George Penrith understood construction, but he failed to understand that deception works the same way. You cannot build a convincing lie if the small supporting facts are weak. A barrel that doesn't splash, a pin that smears like pencil, a daybook entry in the wrong ink. These are the weak points that cause the entire structure to fail. Tommy Penrith wiped his eyes roughly. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. If I'd paid more attention, if I'd noticed something. You have nothing to apologize for, Miss Marple told him firmly. Your uncle deceived everyone, including those who loved him most. That is his crime, not yours. Inspector Slack gathered his evidence bags. George Penrith has confessed. Faced with the physical evidence and the inconsistencies in his story, he finally admitted everything. He'll stand trial for murder, and I expect the Crown will have no difficulty securing a conviction. As the group dispersed, Dolly walked with Miss Marple back toward the village, the evening light golden on the ancient stones of the old church. It's over then, Dolly said. Yes, my dear. Justice will be served, though it cannot restore Adrian Fielding to life or spare his family their grief. You saved Will Drew from a lifetime of false guilt. That at least is something. A good man should not suffer for another's evil. They paused at the church gate, looking back at the scaffolding where Bunting had once hung so cheerfully. So little a thing, Dolly murmured, to drop so mighty a stone. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, preparing to walk on. Yes, she replied. Churches are built of faith and pins. One must be very sure of which one holds.